All right, everybody. We're here today to talk about the background information for the Iliad. The Iliad is a long epic poem from ancient Greek civilization describing events from near the end of the Trojan War. The Iliad is noteworthy because it's probably the oldest work of literature that we study, not just because of its age or because of what it says about a culture, but because of its quality as a work of literature, the depth of its characters, the strength of its themes, the writing style of the poetry. All of those are a very high level of quality in the Iliad. So it's the most significant work that we've studied to date. So let's talk a little bit about the Iliad and what you need to know before you start reading. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the people that you'll be reading about in the Iliad. Now, when we talk about the Iliad, we often refer to ancient Greece and frequently refer to one side of the conflict that's described in the Iliad as being the Greeks. But that's a bit misleading. The whole idea of a nation like Greece or America or England or Poland or whatever is a relatively recent development. And certainly in the ancient world, there was no such place as Greece. Instead, you had a series of cities that were effectively independent of each other, but lived in a sort of mutual relationship, which is one reason why when you read the Iliad, you'll read about a whole number of different kings and princes and things, because every city is kind of its own little political entity. The most powerful Greek city-state at the time of the Iliad is a city called Mycenae. The Mycenaeans dominated the area that we today call Greece, from around 1600 BC to around 1200 BC. So frequently we refer to that era as the Mycenaean era. And if you had gone back in time and asked one of the soldiers fighting on what we today call the Greek side, they wouldn't have identified themselves as being Greek. They would have identified the city that they came from and maybe acknowledged that Mycenae was the most important city at the time. Homer will often call them Argives, which is a different word that again for that group of people, but it again indicates that there is no sort of Greece at this time. Don't confuse the characters from the Iliad with the ancient Greeks from the movie 300, or what we think of as the golden age of Athens, the time of like Socrates and Plato and the birth of democracy and all that, or certainly with people from modern Greece. 300 and the Golden Age of Athens are, 1,000 years or more after the events that are described in the Iliad, and several Greek civilizations rise and fall before the things come up that you picture in your mind when maybe someone says ancient Greece, the Parthenon and togas and things like that. This is a much earlier time period. If you think about 1,000 years ago, what did America look like? Is it very connected to what it is today? That's sort of the relationship between the characters in the Iliad and somebody like Plato or Socrates. So the Mycenaean Greeks probably fought a war against the trading city of Troy in Asia Minor around 1250 BC. We say probably because there's very little information. In fact, most of the historical information we have from this period comes from poems like the Iliad, and they're not designed to be historical documents. They're designed to be poetry and art. So we're pretty sure that a war did in fact take place. Archaeologists have discovered the ruins of a city that they believe is Troy. So it makes sense that the Mycenaean Greeks, for several reasons that I'll discuss later in this presentation, would have attacked and destroyed this city. But for all we know, it was a different empire that destroyed the city of Troy that didn't have anything to do with the Mycenaeans, if it existed at all. This is a Bronze Age suit of armor. So this is the kind of thing that the Mycenaean soldiers will be wearing when we read the Iliad. So again, trying to get sort of a sense of the dates involved in the amount of time. Here's a timeline that shows how much time will have elapsed between when Gilgamesh lived, which is the earliest date we sort of talked about in this class, and the composition of the Iliad. So Gilgamesh lives in 2500 BC. The Iliad is first written down in 800 BC. So Gilgamesh would have been about 1,500 years older than anyone who would have read the Iliad. So think of 1,500 years ago. That's the into the Roman Empire. That's how much time elapsed between the life of Gilgamesh and the life of the poet who wrote the Iliad. You can see some of these other dates in between, again, to sort of give you a sense of scale of time for when this happened. For example, the Trojan War, like we said, probably happened in 1200 BC. And the book of Genesis was probably first written down in about 1100 BC. Here's another timeline, again, trying to show you sort of the sense of scale here. On one end, we've got Gilgamesh. On the other hand, we've got me teaching this class. And in the middle of those would be something like the assassination of Julius Caesar. So by the time Caesar was assassinated, about as much time had passed since Gilgamesh lived as has passed since Caesar's assassination. And you can see that the composition of the Iliad is closer to that event, to the assassination of Caesar, than it was to the life of Gilgamesh. So big scales of time going on here. And when we think about the ancient world, sometimes we think of that as being one sort of thing that happened, but it's spread out over considerably more time than events that we think of from the modern era. Okay, so this is a political map of modern Europe. Greece is down here, just in case you didn't know. And Troy, as I said, would have been in Asia Minor, which is in present-day Turkey. So all the events of the Homeric epics, which are the Iliad and another long poem he wrote called the Odyssey, took place in that area there. This is a map showing all the different city-states that we know of that are represented in the Iliad. So all of these different places are sort of their own governing entity. I'm just waving this pointer all over the map right now. But all of these places are their own little governing entity with their own king and their own slightly different civilization. But all of these places are also unified by kind of a common culture. So even the Trojans, who were at war with the Mycenaeans, worship the same gods and speak the same language, as we'll see. So this is kind of the world that the characters from the Iliad come from. All of the action in the Iliad takes place in Troy. If you read the Odyssey, it covers all of this territory and considerably more. So let's talk a little bit about the person who wrote the Iliad. We know him as Homer. That's the name that history has recorded for the author of the Iliad. So who was Homer? Well, if you go to the, for example, the Museum of History in London, you'll see this bust of Homer, and it says that that's what Homer looked like. But really, we have no idea. Homer might as well have looked like Homer Simpson as like that bust, because there's very little recorded history from this time period. Legends tell us that Homer was blind, possibly based on some clues that are hidden in the etymology of his name, but it also makes sense that someone who would have been a professional poet might have been blind, because if they could see, there were other jobs that the society would have needed them to do. It's probably more likely that Homer is from Asia Minor than from Greece, and historians know that because his sense of geography when he's talking about events taking place in and around Troy is pretty good. His sense of geography when he's talking about events that take place in Greece is pretty awful. He seems to know a lot more about where things really are in Troy than in Greece. For a long time, scholars disputed the idea that there was a Homer. They thought that the Iliad and the Odyssey represented the work of many different poets sort of coming together. But increasingly today, scholars believe that there was, in fact, one person who wrote these two long poems. The Iliad describes the events that take place in the 10th and final year of the Trojan War, and then the other one, the Odyssey, which describes the journey of one of the heroes home from the Trojan War. So Homer is really significant in that he's living at a time period where literacy is first starting to become a thing. So there's a lot of evidence that the Iliad was originally recited orally, but over the course of Homer's lifetime became something that was written down. So that's why it's probably one of the highest qualities of these ancient epics, because Homer was someone who was working with both, not just the spoken, but also the written word. But very little is known about who he really was. So there's a lot of speculation involved in all of this. Here we have some images from Bronze Age civilization. So you'll hear lots about weapons in the Iliad because it is a poem about war. You will hear swords referred to, but again, this is the Bronze Age. Bronze is the most sophisticated metal that these people have to work with, like in these swords that you see here. And bronze is a very weak metal, so swords are always breaking in the Iliad. They are not the most reliable weapons. Most of the fighting that takes place in the Iliad is done with spears, because it's easier to make a spear with bronze than a sword. You'll hear a lot about chariots, like you see these two guys riding here. This was a point in time before people had learned to ride horses. That wasn't a thing at this point in time. So chariots are used in the battle because people developed these carts that were pulled behind horses. So really you'll see the role of chariots being to sort of get characters from one place in the fight to another, and then they get off their chariot and fight somebody. And down here at the bottom there's an image of a helmet, like the characters will wear in the story. You hear references to the horsehair crests on their helmets, which you see here. Now, there are several inconsistencies in the Iliad that reflect the fact that the manuscript was probably sort of edited and changed over time as it was sort of passed down. So sometimes that weaponry changes a little bit. Sometimes the characters aren't at all familiar with an element like iron, which becomes the next big thing that civilizations use after bronze. Sometimes they're actually familiar with it. So there are those inconsistencies, but by and large we have a depiction of Bronze Age warfare in the Iliad. Okay, this is a picture of what an artist believes the city of Troy might have actually looked like. Troy, as it's presented in the Iliad, is a very wealthy trading city that has very high walls. In the world of the story, those walls were built by the god Poseidon. So this is what Troy might have looked like. This is a picture from the archaeological excavation of what archaeologists believe is the city of Troy, or the remains of the city of Troy. And you can see the walls there. Troy was only discovered in the 20th century. The city was, and there's still some contention as to even if these ruins are Troy. Okay, let's meet some of the characters that we're going to be encountering in the Iliad. The Iliad sort of takes place on two levels. In the Iliad, you have a story about human beings who are fighting with each other, and then there's also the world of the gods. And the gods are very important in the Iliad and interact a lot with the characters. You can think of the gods in the Iliad as representing sort of the different sides of the characters' personalities sometimes. Because the gods in the Iliad will very rarely come down and like actually make something happen. A god isn't going to appear and like fight a human, for example. Though they do that occasionally, it's very rare. Much more frequently, the gods in the Iliad are presented as sort of speaking to characters and trying to influence their behavior in one way or another. So there's different levels that you can choose to interpret the Iliad. You can read it like the gods are characters in the story, or sometimes it makes sense to think of them as like different aspects of the characters' personalities. So the main gods that you need to be concerned about. You need to know who Zeus is. Zeus is the king of the gods. And we'll talk in class about what that means to be king of the gods and what his position as king is. But it will help to start thinking in terms of parallels to what we were just describing about all those different city-states that made up ancient Greece. The Greeks don't really have a concept of sort of absolute authority, and we'll see how Zeus is able to sort of maintain control over the other gods over the course of the Iliad. Zeus's wife is named Hera. She's the queen of the gods and effectively the second most powerful. The god of the sea is Poseidon. Poseidon is god of the sea and earthquakes, and he is Zeus's brother. The goddess Aphrodite is the goddess of love, and she's very important to why the Trojan War is going on, at least in the Iliad. And she is one of Zeus's daughters. The goddess Athena, who you see pictured here in this statue, is a goddess of wisdom and warcraft and sort of strategy. She's another one of Zeus's daughters. The god Apollo is a god of truth and justice, and one of Zeus's children. You've probably heard of the messenger god Hermes. He is the god who flies around on winged sandals, which are used by a lot of different companies as their logos today. Hermes is the messenger god, but in the Iliad, most of the messages are delivered by a different messenger god, and her name is Iris. Now, one thing that you will notice very early on as we're reading the Iliad is that different gods have different allegiances in this Trojan War. The gods are very interested in how this war is going to work out, and different gods support different sides. For example, for reasons that we'll discuss in a second here, Hera and Aphrodite and Apollo are big supporters of the Trojans, whereas Athena is a big supporter of the Greeks. Athena is as I said, the goddess of sort of wisdom and cunning and strategy. And the Greeks really value those qualities and always sort of look to Athena as being one of their most important gods. Oh, and there's one more that we need to worry about. That is the goddess Thetis. She is most important because she is the mother of one of the Greek soldiers, a guy named Achilles, who we're going to talk about in a second here. But first, let's talk about the Trojans. Trojans that you need to worry about. The king of Troy is a guy named Priam, and his wife is named Hecuba. But Priam and Hecuba are very old when this story takes place. Priam does not really serve as sort of the day-to-day leader of Troy, and he certainly doesn't do any fighting. The most important Trojan is Hector. Hector is Priam and Hecuba's son, so he is Prince of Troy, and he is Troy's greatest warrior. Man for man, the Trojans are not nearly as good at being soldiers as the Greeks are. And the big Trojan heroes are typically presented as being weaker than the big Greek soldiers. But Hector is sort of their big equalizer. Hector is the most important Trojan. Often in the Iliad and the Odyssey, you can look at characters' names, and it will give you some clues about what they do in the story. Hector's name translates to mean the holder, or the one who holds things together. And that's what Hector does for the Trojans. He's really the only reason why they have not already lost the war at the beginning of the story. Andromache is Hector's wife, and they have a baby son, an infant named Astyanax. Quick note on pronunciation, and you may have started to notice this already, but when we're pronouncing Greek names, we always pronounce that last E. So, for example, Nike is a Greek goddess and also the name of a shoe company. Paris is Hector's brother. And Paris is very different in personality than Hector, where Hector is sort of this loyal, hardworking soldier. Paris is frequently in the story presented as more of kind of an idle playboy. And we'll talk about how that has caused some problems for the Trojans. And then there's a couple of women who are important to the story. Their names are Briseis and Chryseis. And what you need to know is at the beginning of the story, they have both been captured by the Greeks and are being held as basically as hostages or prizes of war, depending on how you want to look at it, by the Greek soldiers. Briseis and Chryseis both have a father. Briseis is the daughter of Brises, and Chryseis is the daughter of Chryses. And we'll talk more about them and how important they are to the story in a little bit. Here's a picture of Troy Polamalu. He does not appear in the Iliad. Okay, Greeks that you need to be familiar with. Achilles is the most important of the Greeks. Achilles is far and away their best warrior. Achilles is he is a prince. He comes from a place called Pythia, and he is a demigod. As we said earlier, his mother is the goddess Thetis. Achilles is easily the Greeks' best soldier, and he's presented as really being this sort of unstoppable force in war. But he is not the leader of all of the Greeks. He is another one of these sort of loosely allied leaders of city-states. And we'll talk about how he factors in with some of these other characters. the nominal leader of the Greeks is a guy named Agamemnon. Agamemnon is king of Mycenae. You should remember from the beginning of this presentation that we're talking about Mycenaean Greece. So as king of Mycenae, Agamemnon is leader of the most important city. He is the strongest king in that sense. He has the kind of the biggest army, the most material resources. He's not as good a soldier as Achilles, but he has authority that he draws from other sources. Menelaus is Agamemnon's brother. Menelaus is king of Sparta. Nestor is another one of these Greek city-state kings. He is the oldest and sort of the wisest in terms of life experience of the Greek kings. Odysseus is another one of these Greek city-state kings. Agamemnon has basically, as you'll see, created an alliance of all these different city-states. So you have all these different kings of little places who have come together to make one big army. Odysseus is from an island called Ithaca. And Odysseus, he is the sort of most clever of the Greeks. I mentioned earlier that the Greeks really value being clever, being smart, which is why they like Athena so much. Odysseus is a minor character in the Iliad. He's the most important character in the Odyssey, which tells the story of his return from the Trojan War. Patroclus is Achilles' cousin and close friend. Some other Greek kings and warriors that will come up. There are two different soldiers named Ajax. There's a great big one called the Great Ajax. He is the largest and strongest of the Greek warriors, but he's not the smartest. There's a different unrelated character named Little Ajax. Diomedes is an important soldier for a while. Phoenix is an old man who's there as an advisor to Achilles. So these are all some different Greek characters that you'll need to be familiar with. Here's a picture of the Achilles tendon, which is in fact named for Achilles. Now this part's going to be a little confusing because you've probably heard a few things about Achilles already. One legend that you might be familiar with is that Achilles is immortal, that he was dipped in the river Styx by his mother Thetis, and she was holding his heel, and that's the only vulnerable part of his body. Now here's the thing. In the Iliad, that legend isn't part of the story. There's no reference in the Iliad to Achilles being immortal or invulnerable or having like a weak spot in his heel or anything like that. Remember that we're reading about legends and myths. We're reading about lots of different versions of stories, a lot of things that were passed down orally for a long time before they were written down. So different authors from around this time period, different poets, came up with different conceptions of these characters. In our story, Achilles is the greatest Greek warrior. He is a demigod. He is a warrior on a level unequaled by any of the other characters, but he is not like an immortal, or he doesn't have this particular weak spot in the Iliad. All right, so let's talk about why we're fighting a war. Why does the Trojan War exist? Well, here's the myth. And this is what Homer believed was responsible for the war happening, and he references it multiple times in his story in the Iliad. So according to the myth, there was a banquet for all of the gods, and they were all having a great time. But Eris, who is the goddess of discord, was not invited. Discord is like chaos, is like people not getting along with each other. So the gods and goddesses elected not to invite Eris to this banquet they were having. So in order to get her revenge, Eris throws an apple into the banquet, and this is a golden apple, and on it she has engraved "For the fairest." That's the same fairest as in like mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all. It's the indication that this is for the most beautiful goddess there. And Eris knew that if she threw this in, this would cause an argument about who was the most beautiful goddess, who deserved this apple. So the three goddesses who fight for the apple are Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite. And one thing that you need to understand about Greek gods is they are extraordinarily selfish. You can look at Greek gods as being sort of entirely consumed by whatever it is that they are the god of. And they don't really think about, they can't really think about other people. Achilles, I'm getting off on a sidebar, but Achilles, who is half god, shares that trait sometimes. So this huge quarrel breaks out between Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warcraft, Hera, the queen of the gods, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, about who's the most beautiful, who deserves this apple. So they decide that the way they're going to settle this is to go get Paris, Prince of Troy, who we heard about earlier, who is this very sort of good-looking young man who has kind of a reputation with ladies. So they go get Paris and they ask him to judge which of these three goddesses deserves the apple. So, and all three of them attempt to bribe Paris. Paris goes with Aphrodite. He says that Aphrodite, the goddess of love, is the most beautiful. So as a reward, Aphrodite gives Paris the love of Helen, right? Helen is known as the most beautiful woman in the world at this point in time, and she becomes known as Helen of Troy because she falls in love with Paris thanks to Aphrodite. This is how Aphrodite bribed him to win the contest. And Paris spirits her off to Troy, and that's where they're living together at the beginning of the story. The problem is that she wasn't called Helen of Troy at the beginning. She was Helen of Sparta because she was married to Menelaus. Menelaus is one of the Greek kings. He's king of Sparta, so Paris runs off with his wife, the most beautiful woman in the world. He's annoyed, and so his brother Agamemnon, who's king of Mycenae, the most important Greek city-state, decides to fight a war to bring back Helen and restore his brother's honor. So the selfishness of the Greek gods leads to this war between human beings. That's kind of the myth version of the story. And there's an apple. Now, let's say we wanted to interpret these events as they maybe really happened without a bunch of gods living up on Mount Olympus. And that's where Homer has his gods living. Mount Olympus is this really high mountain in ancient Greece. But let's say if we climbed Mount Olympus, we wouldn't actually find any gods up there, that there never was a contest about who deserves this apple or anything like that. So, remember a few of the details we've already talked about. Troy is a wealthy trading city. It's very cultured, very sophisticated. There's a lot of money in Troy. If you went back and looked at that map, you would notice that Troy is sort of in between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So all kinds of ships and traffic might be going near there. There's a lot of money in Troy. Greece, on the other hand, is this rocky, mountainous, relatively uncivilized place full of tough sea warriors. Honestly, the Greeks, as presented in the Iliad, are pirates. And their civilization is presented, the Mycenaean civilization is nowhere near as culturally sophisticated as Troy. Paris is a handsome playboy prince from this sophisticated, cultured city of Troy. Helen is this beautiful woman who's married to one of these, rough sea pirates. So it's not a stretch to imagine that Paris might be able to seduce Helen away from Menelaus without the interference of the goddess Aphrodite. Then you have Agamemnon, who's brother to Menelaus, and now here's this golden opportunity, as it were, for him to take his tough army of sea pirates off to attack this trading city. So go back to what I said earlier about the gods. You can almost think of the gods as representing different sides of human nature. So does Helen leave Menelaus and run off with Paris because the goddess Aphrodite sort of whispers in her ear? Or does she give in to her sort of desires and somewhat logically want to leave this rough, uncultured place of Sparta and run off to the fanciest, nicest city in the ancient world of Troy? Likewise for Agamemnon, is this really a war about restoring his brother's honor, or is this an opportunity to go sack a city that has all kinds of nice things that he would like to have? So the story makes sense with or without the gods, but for Homer, the teller of our tale, those gods are very real. So we're going to be reading the story that and our story, by the way, takes place entirely in the last year of the Trojan War. At the beginning of the story, Homer tells us that the Trojan War has been going on for 10 years. Now, did it really last for 10 years? We don't really know. There is a ancient Greek idiom, an ancient Greek sort of figure of speech that talks about anytime you do something that's really difficult or time-consuming or takes a while to do, they have this figure of speech 9 times and then the 10th. that it was like on the 10th try that you got it. So a lot of the, like for example, Odysseus' journey home in the Odyssey supposedly takes 10 years as well. Whatever the case may be, it's been a long war, and we're going to be reading about events that lead to the end of that war. Though I'll tell you now that we won't actually get to the end of it. There will not be a Trojan horse in the Iliad. That comes from other legends and stories. So let's talk about some key Greek concepts you need to understand in order to get what's going on in the Iliad. One of the most important ideas in this story is the idea of a geros, or war prize. In the Iliad, the geros is awarded to a soldier for his achievements in battle, and it's a literal representation of that soldier's value. So if the king rewards one of his soldiers with money or armor, or as we'll see in the story, with a woman who's been captured, it's like that bit of money or armor or that human being that they have enslaved represents that warrior's achievement. So the geros is extremely important. One thing that happens a lot in the Iliad is a soldier will kill a soldier from the other side. And the very first thing that he starts doing is trying to take the armor off of the corpse of his fallen enemy, because he needs the armor. He needs that physical sign of his victory. And so a lot of the times characters will then get killed when they're trying to take the armor off of somebody else, and now there's a new fight for their armor. And sometimes you get these huge chains of people fighting and dying trying to recover armor because it's a geros, because it's sort of this literal representation of an achievement in battle. Another key idea for the Iliad is the code of supplication. The ancient Greeks believed that Zeus protected suppliants. To be a suppliant means you acknowledge that someone else is in a powerful position over you and you beg for their help. And if a suppliant does what they're supposed to do and makes some sort of offer to try and repay the person they're asking for help from, Zeus protects them and they have to be treated with honor and respect. We will see several different suppliants in the Iliad and talk about how they're treated and who acts in accordance with the code of supplication and who does not. A few key literary terms that it might be worth reviewing. Remember that an epic is a long poem told in an elevated style. The Iliad is absolutely an example of an epic. In medias res means in the middle of things. Epics usually begin in the middle of the story. And as I said, when we read the Iliad, we'll see it starts almost at the end of the war. And there are some important details that need to be filled in through flashbacks over the course of the story. So most epics begin in medias res, sort of right in the middle of the story. And then characters need to sort of go back and explain to us why things are the way they are. We mentioned epithets in talking about Gilgamesh. Epithets are going to be much more important in the Iliad. Keep an eye out for epithets and think about the way that Homer refers to characters. This is poetry that was written to conform to a particular meter and also written to be easy to remember. So a lot of the times there are sort of these different little code phrases used to describe characters.